Of the 70-odd novels Agatha Christie wrote over her 50-year career, And Then There Were None is usually considered to be her magnum opus. Not only is it one of the most famous crime stories ever written, but it's also just one of the best-selling novels of all time, right up there with Lord of the Rings, Alice in Wonderland, and Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. In the 8 decades since its publication, And Then There Were None has been made into over a dozen adaptations, and the basic premise, a group of strangers gathered together in a creepy location, cut off from the outside world, and hunted by a killer who could only be one of them, has inspired mystery novels, horror films, a TV tropes page, and of course, comedic masterpieces like this one.
I didn't do it!
Now, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you pause this video and go do that now before I spoil the ending for you. It's a timeless classic as well as just a cracking good read. Okay? Did you read it? Then let's press on. And Then There Were None isn't just the Queen of Crime's most influential novel, it's also her darkest. The ending is so grim that almost all of the film, theater, and video game adaptations made in the subsequent 80 years have chosen to scrap it, instead going with a happy ending where the mystery is solved, the killer is stopped, and the innocent survivors go off and get married. The original novel is a lot different to this. Nobody solves the mystery. The killer is never caught, and everyone, and I mean everyone, ends up dead. Our story kicks off with a group of strangers arriving on a remote island off the coast of Devon at the behest of a mysterious host. Once there, they're played a gramophone recording in which an unidentified voice accuses them all of murder.
What do you mean? Murder.
Cut off from the mainland, the 10 guests are killed off, one by one, in the order and method described in a children's rhyme. Now, the rhyme itself varies from edition to edition, and this is where we start to get into uncomfortable territory. See, when it was first published in 1939, the novel was actually called something I'm not going to say, but if I tell you it was based on an old British blackface song, I think you can probably guess. This was immediately changed to 10 Little Indians for the US market, and still later editions changed it to 10 Little Soldiers or 10 Little Sailors, which is standard practice today. If you discovered And Then There Were None through one of these soldier or sailor versions, which if you were born after 1970, you probably did, you might be surprised to hear that race actually played a very important role in the original story. Now, these themes have been more or less erased in the later editions, resulting in a story that's much more palatable for modern audiences, or at least as palatable as a story about 10 people being systematically murdered could realistically be. But for the purposes of this video, I want to go with the 10 Little Indians edition, the one from my parents' day. And I want to be clear that this is not because I approve of casual racism, but because I think that understanding the role race played in the original story is crucial to understanding the ideas that made it so important in the first place. Now, I know this is a controversial claim, so don't worry, I'm going to get back to this point later. But first, let's talk about the premise. Christie makes it clear right from the beginning that this is not going to be your average murder mystery. Most whodunits are based on the premise that someone has committed a murder. The only questions left to be resolved are who and how. But And Then There Were None immediately introduces the idea of an ambiguous murder. All of our victims start the novel having been indirectly implicated in someone's death. Now, these crimes run the gamut from actual negligent homicide, like a surgeon who loses a patient because he operates while drunk, or a reckless driver who kills 2 children in a hit and run, to even more vague crimes, like a woman who drives her maid to suicide, or a soldier who deliberately sends his wife's lover on a fatal mission. The killer's argument is that although these may be crimes the law can't touch, either because they can't be proven in court or because they aren't technically illegal, they are still murder, and therefore still deserving of punishment. And of course, he takes it on himself to administer that punishment, systematically and ruthlessly. As each victim is dispatched, the killer smashes one of 10 porcelain figurines, racist caricatures in the early versions, soldiers or sailors in the later versions. The obvious implication here is that the 10 Little Indians are the victims, and the victims are the Indians. Once our characters put this together, the rhyme starts to serve as a mocking countdown, taunting them with their inevitable deaths until the last one becomes so neurotic and suggestible that she actually hangs herself just to complete the poem. One little Indian boy left all alone. He went and hanged himself, and then there were none. With all of this, Christie is pushing the boundaries of the traditional murder mystery, giving us a novel that's much more like a psychological thriller than it is a traditional whodunit. Unlike her other stories, the emphasis is much less on the killer's methods and motives than on the slowly deteriorating psyches of her victims. We watch as they gradually unravel into mental breakdowns and eventually violence. With her free, indirect, third-person narration, Christie gives us brief glimpses into her victims' thoughts, showing us their growing paranoia and obsessive, guilty ruminations. In his final confession, the killer actually admits that this was part of the punishment. He kills his victims in reverse order of guilt so that the guiltiest would live the longest and therefore suffer the most. What's important to note in all of this is that, at least in the beginning of the novel, none of these people actually see themselves as murderers. They all either deny the charges altogether or claim that their actions were justified, even virtuous. Emily Brent, for example, the employer who drove her pregnant maid to suicide, insists that she behaved perfectly properly in light of her maid's sinful behavior. William Henry Bloor, the police officer who committed perjury and sent an innocent man to jail, insists that the man really was a crook who deserved it. Christie hasn't given us a group of evil, gloating, mustache-twirling sociopaths, in other words. These are normal, respectable, even moral people. It's not that they think that murder is acceptable, it's just that they don't think that what they did qualifies.
It's all nonsense. Everyone was simply doing their duty.
Of all of these characters, I want to draw particular attention to Lombard, the soldier of fortune and one of the last to die. Now, unlike the others, Lombard openly admits to his crime, causing the deaths of 21 East African tribesmen by stealing their food and leaving them to starve. He claims not to feel guilty about this because
self-preservation's a man's first duty. And natives don't mind dying, you know. They don't feel about it as Europeans do.
The fact that Lombard is saved almost for last shows that the killer, at least, considers his crime to be one of the worst. But several of the other victims take Lombard's side, agreeing that this wasn't really a serious crime because his victims were only natives. The implication here is that Lombard, a European, was morally justified in trading the lives of natives for his own, which was worth more. It's a very chilling colonialist attitude that quickly takes on an ironic turn when these white British people find themselves hunted by a killer who refers to them as 10 little, insert racial slur here. Now, this may seem like a minor plot point, but I actually think that the story about Lombard and the tribesmen is the key to unraveling this whole novel. For a start, it clues us in as to why these people don't see themselves as murderers to begin with. And the reason is very simple. They're white, English, respectable. Respectable Englishmen don't commit murder. It's no coincidence that Christie has made her 10 little victims figures of moral authority. We've got a judge, a police officer, a teacher, a soldier, a pillar of the religious community. These are the people who make the rules of society and who enforce them. These are the people who decide what is proper, upright, moral British behavior and what isn't. If they decide that what they did was proper, well, who's going to tell them otherwise?
Dying? But she wasn't going to die. The others would die, yes, but not she, Emily Brent. All her people were service people. They led upright lives, just as she, Emily Brent, had led an upright life. She had never done anything to be ashamed of, and so, naturally, she wasn't going to die.
Okay, enough delay. Let's talk about the race thing. Now, for those of you who have only read the sanitized modern versions, I want to do a quick recap of all the racial and colonial references in the original novel. And there are plenty. First of all, we have the actual nursery rhyme that ties the whole novel together. The 10 little what-have-yous, which is framed and hung prominently in every room in the house. We have the racist figurines representing the murder victims, which are symbolically smashed. We have Indian Island itself, where this whole story takes place, so named because it's supposedly shaped like an American Indian's head. There are several uses of the phrase N-word in the woodpile, a thankfully outdated expression referring to something hidden and sinister, similar to skeletons in the closet. Colonialism becomes a plot point when one of the guests, Bloor, tries to pass himself off as a South African colonist, only to be exposed by Lombard, whose own story I've just discussed. And at one point, Vera becomes hysterical when one of the other guests makes a reference to our black brothers. So the shadow of colonialism is all over this story. Race is an omnipresent theme. And yet, despite all of these references, there aren't any actual people of color in this story. You might think, well, of course there aren't. After all, the whole reason our cast of characters was able to get away with their crimes is because of their relatively privileged positions in society. But what this actually does on a literary level is create an atmosphere where the specter of otherness is looming everywhere, from every page in the novel, from every room in the house. But the actual other never shows up. He is hauntingly, conspicuously absent. This atmosphere, where the other is both everywhere and nowhere, adds a layer of white anxiety and paranoia to an already tense situation. Once our 10 little victims realize that they're being hunted, they begin to tear Indian Island apart, looking for an 11th guest, the murderer. But when every cave, cellar, and coat closet proves empty, they're left with no option but to accuse, torment, and even kill each other, and eventually themselves. One of the telling things about this novel is that even though all of the victims rationalize their own behavior, most of them are horrified by the other's actions. Throughout the novel, the characters make repeated allusions to crime as something that other people do, to death as something that happens to other people, to murder as something that is antithetical to normal, respectable British society. But as they search the house, vainly looking for the real murderer, the 10 Little Indians rhyme taunts them from every room. It's as if the killer is saying, "Look all you like. The only Indian on this island is you." At one point, the victims reflect that the situation might actually be less horrible if the house only had more dark corners in which to hide.
But this house was the essence of modernity. There was nothing hidden in this house, nothing concealed. Somehow that was the most frightening thing of all.
The implication is that what these characters are really frightened of is being exposed, not of what they can't see, but what they don't want to see in each other, and especially themselves. And this is where the novel gets really gothic. As we watch the victims slowly deteriorate into mental breakdowns and outright violence, we realize that the real source of horror here isn't that the killer is one of them. It's that the killer is all of them. And whereas most murder mysteries culminate in the murderer being exposed and brought to justice, the climax of And Then There Were None happens when Vera recognizes her own guilt and hangs herself, admitting that she is, in fact, other people. I mentioned earlier that most adaptations tend to do away with Christie's original ending, instead substituting a happy one where Vera and Lombard, innocent in these versions, catch the killer, survive, and go off and get married. But in 2015, the BBC produced a 3-part miniseries adaptation of And Then There Were None that not only keeps the original ending, but actually ramps up the levels of violence and gore. In this version, the crimes are a lot less ambiguous. Lombard actively kills the tribesmen instead of leaving them to die. MacArthur shoots his wife's lover instead of sending him on a fatal mission. Rogers smothers his employer with a pillow instead of withholding her medication. Bloor beats his victim to death instead of just sending him to jail on trumped-up charges. And pretty much everyone behaves like a complete, utter sociopath. And yet, despite all of these attempts to make the story, well, darker, the race themes are still missing.
Welcome to Soldier Island.
Now, I've already said that I don't approve of casual racism, but I would argue that removing the racial themes from And Then There Were None is a little bit like removing the race themes from To Kill a Mockingbird. You just don't end up with the same story. But because race is much more of an implied theme in And Then There Were None, it's much easier to overlook and, consequently, to write out. Now, don't get me wrong. I do think the decision to change Christie's original title, the one I can't say, was definitely the right call. Even in the 40s in America, the N-word was so charged that it really would have affected the way the book was received. But the second change, from 10 Little Indians to 10 Little Soldiers, that gives me pause. And I think it's because it obscures the function of the nursery rhyme in the original story. Nursery rhymes, children's songs, fairy tales, these are all pretty commonly found in horror and thrillers generally. There are two reasons for this. First, it's creepy. And second, it gives us a glimpse into the killer's backstory and motives, usually indicating a person who's emotionally stunted or deranged from childhood trauma. But this is not the case in And Then There Were None. The murderer isn't stunted or childish, but disturbingly rational, cold-blooded, and self-aware. He even claims that he was born sadistic, denying us the usual explanation of trauma-induced mental illness. Wargrave has a reputation as a hanging judge, and the rhyme he uses isn't a childish fixation, but a moral judgment. By using a racial slur to describe his victims, he is essentially saying that under their armor of British respectability, these people are no better than savages. Now, obviously, the association of colonized people with savagery is extremely offensive, but here the rhyme has a lot less to do with the people who are colonized than the people doing the colonizing. The fact that it's a nursery rhyme reminds us that these people were born during the height of British colonialism. They have been raised from childhood with that sense of moral complacency exemplified by Kipling's The White Man's Burden. They take it for granted that they are the ethnically and ethically superior race, ordained by God to discipline and civilize the barbarous other through any means, even violent ones. Remember that Vera defends Lombard's crime by arguing that his victims were only natives. The unspoken assumption here is that British people are morally justified in determining the fates of other people because they themselves are inherently more moral. By flipping the script, by turning the colonizers into the natives, Wargrave is stripping them of this comforting moral authority. And his 10 Little Indians prove all too willing in the end to illustrate that they really are savages. But when we change the rhyme to 10 Little Soldiers, all of this subtext gets lost. The word soldier in 1930s Britain would have conjured up the image of somebody honorable, upright, dutiful. Calling his victims 10 Little Soldiers tells us nothing at all about the killer's motives except to imply that he has some sort of unexplained childish fixation, which isn't the case. Now, I don't want you all to run off to Cornwall with the idea that And Then There Were None is some sort of masterpiece of anti-colonialist literature. It's not. Agatha Christie was a genius within her particular field, but we have no real reason to think of her as an active or informed political thinker. There are a few examples of unconscious racism finding its way into her work, and I think that's important to acknowledge. Race in And Then There Were None is much more of a literary theme than a political one. But cutting it out of the novel altogether really reduces the scope of Christie's work. This isn't a novel about colonialism. It's about something much bigger. And Then There Were None ends with a confession by the killer, Justice Wargrave, explaining how, and more importantly, why he killed these particular victims. In this confession, Wargrave explains that he was motivated by a lifelong sadistic desire to kill, but only, specifically, those who deserved it.
From an early age, I knew very strongly the lust to kill. But side by side with this went a contradictory trait, a strong sense of justice. It is abhorrent to me that an innocent person or creature should suffer or die by any act of mine. I have always felt strongly that right should prevail. It may be understood, I think a psychologist would understand, that with my mental makeup being what it was, I adopted the law as a profession.
This may seem contradictory because in our society we tend to think of violence and morality as opposing forces. Popular culture tends to assume that people who commit acts of violence do so in defiance of morality, either because they're amoral sociopaths who just don't care about the difference between right and wrong, or because they're overwhelmed by emotion that temporarily overrides their sense of morality, as in the so-called crime of passion. But in a powerful recent article written for The New Yorker, psychologist Paul Bloom writes, "In many instances, violence is neither a cold-blooded solution to a problem nor a failure of inhibition. Most of all, it doesn't entail a blindness to moral considerations. On the contrary, morality is often a motivating force. People are impelled to violence when they feel that to regulate certain social relationships, imposing suffering or death is necessary, natural, and ethically gratifying." In other words, most people who commit acts of violence aren't indifferent to the distinction between right and wrong. They just see themselves on the right side of the divide. Bloom illustrates this argument with examples from real life. He explains how genocide, suicide bombings, honor killings, school shootings, punitive rape, gang violence, and domestic abuse are all imagined and described by the perpetrator in terms of punishment or revenge. Think about how many mass shooters publish manifestos before going on the rampage. That doesn't indicate someone who's indifferent to moral considerations. On the contrary, it shows that the real motive is a righteous desire to teach someone a lesson. The school shooter is punishing his classmates for the crime of mistreating or ignoring him. The rapist is punishing his victim for the crime of refusing him. The fascist is punishing the immigrant for desecrating the racial purity of his country. There is a kind of twisted moral reasoning behind even the most horrific acts of violence. Think about how many serial killers in history have specifically targeted sex workers. It might be more comforting to imagine that violent people are just amoral sociopaths, and a lot of fiction likes to portray them that way. But in reality, sociopaths are statistically rare, whereas violence is a lot more common. And you don't have to be a school shooter or a suicide bomber to understand what it's like to want to teach someone a lesson. It's an instinct that drives so many of our works of fiction. Which of us hasn't felt that sense of savage satisfaction when we see the bad guy finally get his comeuppance at the end of a movie? Revenge films are a thing because it's a near universal human trait to want to punish the guilty, even to feel pleasure at their suffering. It's part of how we collectively understand the concept of justice. And Then There Were None is about justice. That's why the killer is a judge. In his confession, Wargrave explains how much pleasure he feels in condemning and sentencing the guilty, acknowledging that he's motivated as much by sadism as he is by righteousness. And although his methods may be extreme, his motives are disturbingly relatable, because whether or not we like to admit it, we all know the desire to inflict punishment. We feel pleasure when we see a mean teacher or horrible boss get a taste of their own medicine. We feel pleasure when we see the downfall of a public figure we consider to be particularly heinous. If the victim is evil enough, we don't think of this feeling as sadism. We think of it as justice, because it's not cruel to take pleasure in someone's pain if they deserve it, right? Christie's characters think in much the same way. Shortly before his death, General MacArthur confesses to sending his wife's lover on a suicidal mission, and he admits,
I suppose in a way it was murder. Curious. Murder. And I've always been such a law-abiding man. But it didn't seem like that at the time. I had no regrets. Served him damn well right, that's what I thought.
Personally, I think this is where the BBC version missed a step. In ramping up the violence, it showed a fundamental misunderstanding of what made the original story so effective in the first place. And Then There Were None isn't a horror story because the characters are all sadistic sociopaths. It's a horror story because the characters are ordinary people, like you and me. What sets Wargrave apart from the others, and from us, isn't necessarily his cruelty so much as his self-awareness. He knows he's not killing because it's necessary or just. He's killing because he enjoys it.
I think a psychologist would understand that with my mental makeup being what it was, I adopted the law as a profession.
The disturbing implication here is that this is the sort of person who makes and enforces the law. This may even be what the justice system is driven by, the need to, as MacArthur would put it, serve people right. Christie seems to be suggesting that it's not just this group of rotten apples who are secret barbarians, but rather that the fundamental institutions of British civilization themselves are not civilized at all, but rather built on savage impulses hypocritically masquerading as morality and justice. In the end, Wargrave accepts his place among the other 10 little Indians, reminding us that he is no different from any of the killers he's condemned, no less guilty. Christie is reminding us that an execution is still a murder. Personally, I think Agatha Christie's reputation is a bit of a double-edged sword. The Queen of Crime is a title that rightly recognizes her genius as a writer and her influence in crime fiction, but it also pigeonholes her. Few people think of crime novels as high literature, after all, and the success and ubiquity of her novels is, ironically, part of what makes them so easy to overlook, because you don't expect to find your deepest, most unconscious beliefs challenged by that cheap paperback you picked up from an airport newsstand. Sure, not all of her 80-odd crime novels are masterpieces. She did write her share of formulaic potboilers, but a surprising number of them do explore the ambiguous nature of guilt, responsibility, and justice. The most famous other example being Murder on the Orient Express, which also blurs the line between a righteous execution and a murder. One of the things that makes classic murder mysteries so exciting is that anybody could be the killer. But Christie also likes to remind us that anybody could be a killer. All they need is the right motive. Personally, I think whoever made the editorial decision to change 10 Little Indians to 10 Little Soldiers wasn't giving Agatha Christie enough credit. They saw the racist overtones, assumed she had put them in without thinking, and took it upon themselves to fix her embarrassing mistake. But in doing that, they obscured the very real genius of her novel. And Then There Were None isn't just a very entertaining thriller, and it is. It's an indictment of the myth of British moral superiority that colonialism was built on. Christie was challenging the foundations of her society, and she still continues to challenge us, the readers of crime fiction, 80 years on. And Then There Were None turns the whole premise of the murder mystery novel on its head. There is no detective. The murderer is never caught. The victims are the killers, and the killers are the victims. The judge is the murderer as well as the executioner, and there is no separation at all between the righteous and the guilty. That's what makes it so bleak. It's not just that everyone dies. It's that we, the readers, are being denied that comforting promise that the whodunit is founded on. The promise that some people are innocent, some people are guilty, and the innocent can identify and punish the guilty accordingly. Most readers will open Christie's novel expecting a clean solution, a clear divide between the killer and the detective who brings him to justice. And they will find 10 dead bodies and an unsolved problem on Indian Island.